Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I know people are still trickling in, but we're going to go ahead and get started with this webinar. And I'll say off the bat, we are going to be recording this webinar. So if you have to leave early or you have colleagues that weren't able to make it, we will be recording. We'll send around the recording after this session, and we'll also make it available in our clearinghouse so folks can access it at any time. So we'll go ahead and get started. And then as we go through the webinar, if you have questions, you can enter them into the Q&A chat, and our comms team will help make sure that get over to me. And I will either answer them as we go through the slides, or we'll save a few minutes at the end for questions. So hello, good morning or good afternoon, depending on your time zone. My name is Lillian Patil, and I work at the Fines and Fees Justice Center as a senior analyst of state and local budgets. And my work at FFJC revolves around providing fiscal support to our teams and to our partner organizations that are working on enacting court-related fines and fees reforms nationwide. And in case you're new here to the fines and fees space, I'll give a very quick overview that this work revolves around making changes to current practices in budgets at local, state, and federal levels where mandatory fees are assessed against people who are involved in various different aspects of the criminal legal system, or additional fines that are outsized or inequitable are imposed upon those who have traffic or criminal offenses. And though these fines and fees may be said to be used as a deterrent against committing a crime, what often ends up happening in practice is they become revenue generators. They become revenue streams that come into public coffers and are used to fund operations and government spending in a way that has incredibly harmful impacts on the individuals and the communities who cannot afford to pay these fines and fees, and equally often harmful impacts on the state budget itself, because the revenue streams make for non-dependable and volatile forms of revenue that puts at risk principles of fiscal responsibility that you do want to be seeing in a public budget. And so my work at FFJC focuses really on this last point and working to understand how various fines and fees in different state or local jurisdictions interact with public budget revenue streams and the way money's spent, and the way that public budgets can be made better as a whole by eliminating those fines and fee streams from budgets altogether. And in doing so, having incredibly positive effects for equity and for folks in the community who owe these fines and fees. The reason I'm able to do this work is that before this role, for close to 5 years, I worked in multiple different jurisdictions at both state and local levels in government executive budget offices. And my primary roles when I was in these jobs was to help lead the development of the annual budget process. Through that process, I saw time and time again firsthand the immense power of budget and the way that they are moral documents and really a concrete manifestation of any one jurisdiction's and their lawmakers' public policy values and priorities. And the reason for that is because of the way that budget's annual process is set up in almost all jurisdictions. So in both state and local jurisdictions, every year there is a sort of snapshot point where the executive office, so the mayor, the governor, collects and adds up all of the different flavors of money or types of revenue that the government is projecting to come into public coffers over the course of the entire next fiscal year, and then assign out each one of these, usually millions and billions of dollars, to one of the many different agencies, operations, programs, grants, all of the different things that it takes to make a government run that take money, that take funding. And what the governor's office at the state level and mayor's office at the local level will end up with is a balanced proposed budget where revenue, or the sources that are coming in, must equal expenditures, or the spending that's projected to be spent down across the jurisdiction. That proposed budget goes to the legislature, where it's reviewed, usually where it's amended, sometimes lightly, sometimes heavily, and then eventually gets enacted to become part of law so that agencies and operations can then spend down the budget over the course of the fiscal year. Because this all happens in one process and you get this sort of snapshot moment, you can see really clearly all at one time the various trade-offs and very intentional choices that our lawmakers must make in order to decide where this fixed pot of public projected revenue is going to go, what's going to get funded, and maybe just as importantly, what isn't going to get funded, what doesn't make the cut because it's not highly enough prioritized to be funded with this fixed amount of money that lawmakers are working with. And that can be really powerful to be able to see those priorities play out in real time in this very concrete way in the budget. And especially as an advocate, and particularly as a fines and fee advocate, it can be incredibly powerful to be able to insert yourself into and leverage that budget process to maximize the effectiveness of your fine or fee campaign. And so I am incredibly passionate about making sure that budgets are used to enact positive social change and really use that immense power that they have to do so. And equally passionate about making sure that anyone who wants to, not just lawmakers, not just members of the executive branch, but the general public and advocates like all of us, to make sure that we can use the budget process and budget tools to maximize the effectiveness of our fines and fees campaigns. And so I'm thrilled to be doing this webinar series with you all. And in this first episode of the webinar series today, we'll be talking about budget books, which are essentially big summaries of annual budgets that come out every year. And they are chock full of information and charts and tools that can help you access, understand, and leverage everything that's going in the budget to work for you and the campaign reform that you may be working on. So our goals today are to understand what budgets are and the relationship, what budget books are and the relationship to budgets, to learn how to use budget books to drive your advocacy efforts. And we'll be looking at a bunch of common characteristics of budget books, and we'll be looking at lots of screenshot of different budget books so you can kind of see the intricacies of how each budget book is set up with these common elements. And then again, we'll try and leave some time at the end for question and answer, but if you do have questions along the way, feel free to put it into the chat. And we will do our best to get it answered over the course of the next hour. Okay, so let's go ahead and start at the beginning. Why should you read a budget book? So if you are working in the fines and fees reform space, you are probably already very familiar with the fact that fines and fees reform is directly tied to changing budget structures. And that's because in order to stop the practice of assessing and collecting fines and fees from people who are involved in the criminal legal system or people who are incarcerated, you usually have to go into the budget itself and change the revenue structure, change the way the budget programs and depends on those fines and fees to balance the budget and to fund spending. And so it can be really important, especially right now when I know so many of you all are going into legislative sessions and advocating for standalone legislation that makes reforms to fines and fees, to be able to understand and speak to that budget process and what's going on in a proposed or enacted budget. But as many of us also know, budgets themselves are long and they are dense and they are complicated because budgets themselves are often hundreds of page documents that are actual pieces of legislation where all of the dollars in some way must be technically appropriated, which is just technical terminology for must be legally assigned to particular types of spending and must be listed out and named in the budget legislation. And because of that, budgets can get really confusing themselves and are not always the easiest point of reference to go to if you're looking to understand the story of the budget or what's going on with a particular revenue or spending stream. And here's a quick example of that. This is a screenshot from Colorado's fiscal 2023 budget. And the reason I'm showing this to you is not for you to read it on this page right now, but just to provide an example of how complicated budget legislation in itself can be. So you can see there's a bunch of different columns going on here with different flavors of money that are being appropriated or authorized. There's different rows to break down the spending that's being funded into different types of costs. There's a lot of complicated footnotes that talk about transfers and eligibility rules and reference back to different parts of statute. All of which to say, it's really hard to go in here and pick out and say, this information helps me understand this important thing about the budget. So budgets, very important pieces of legislation, but can be very confusing to read. Instead, I almost always recommend that people trying to understand their budgets better turn to the budget books. Budget book, you're going to see one of these in my experience, in every city, in every county, and in every state that does a budget. And budget books tell the concise story of the budget. They are made around the same time when the executive office, so the mayor or the governor, puts out their proposed budget. And at this point in the budget cycle, they've spent probably months with their budget office collecting proposals from agencies to understand how much each agency wants to spend, what new initiatives they want funded, and collecting the story of how much revenue is being projected that they think the government will have to work with for the coming year, and have proposed a comprehensive package and a balanced budget where revenues the total has to equal expenditures into one balanced proposed budget that then goes to the legislature for review. Usually, the governor's office will release an annual budget book to accompany that legislation and summarize what's going on in the proposed budget. Advocates can use this just as much as lawmakers or any other member of governments can use this. It's always public. The best way to find your budget book, I found, is just to use Google. Usually I'll Google something like name of state and then governor's or mayor's proposed budget book. What often will come up is a link to an office within the executive branch that's usually called like the Office of Financial Management and Budget, or Operations and Budget, or the Governor's Budget Office, some combination of those buzzwords usually. And on those web pages, you'll usually see a list of public budget documents, and the budget book is almost always one of those. So pretty easy to find with a Google search. And again, these are usually available at both the state and the local level. So advocates can use these budget books to do everything from understanding and leveraging the greater revenue picture and fiscal context, identifying key messaging and storytelling for your advocacy, and finding data on revenue collection and changes over time to a particular fine or fee stream that you may be particularly interested in understanding better. And the reason you can find all these things is the budget book is essentially a storytelling document that's the executive office's chance to lift up and tell lawmakers and residents about what the major themes and highlights are of what's included in the proposed budget, which usually will include hundreds and hundreds of changes. And the budget book is where the governor's office can really concisely tell the story of how they are signing out billions of dollars, usually at the state level, to in a way that they feel will best serve the residents of that state and fulfill on the promises that they've made in their campaigning and in their tenure as mayor or governor. So it includes a lot of common characteristics. Each budget book is different one to the next, depending on the state that you are in. But what we're going to go through today is some common elements that all budget books usually have that you can use in particular to do these the three things and maximize the effectiveness of your reform campaign. A couple quick base things I want to note about budget books before we dive into it. One, budget books usually focus on highlighting incremental changes to budgets. And what that means is they focus on what's new from the previous year. So they'll focus on how much new money is coming in or how much money is lost compared to last year for revenue. What are the new spending initiatives that weren't there last year? Or how is funding for initiatives that are existing, how is that funding growing or shrinking compared to the previous year? So you're often going to be seeing that incremental nature, which can help tell you a helpful story about how things are changing over time. Another thing to know is budget books are released at the time of the proposed budget, not the enacted budget. And the difference between those 2 points is that in the middle, the legislature is reviewing the proposed budget and making amendments, sometimes light, sometimes heavy, depending on the state and the way the branches are set up. And so the dollars and cents may change a little bit during that time by the time you get to the enacted budget that is passed into law. Usually that doesn't bother me because usually, again, the scope of the budget is so large and the dollars are of such a large magnitude that smaller changes here and there don't obstruct the story that the budget book tells and the narrative that you can pull out of that budget book. But if you are someone who's wanting to make sure that you know exactly how much at the end of the day was appropriated for something or other, usually legislative fiscal offices will also have some sort of public document or public spreadsheet where they will list out the changes that are made from the proposed budget to the enacted budget. So you could do, compare those two sources and do some back of the envelope math to come up with the exact dollars and cents. And then one last thing I'll note here before we continue is today we are going to be talking primarily about budget books at the state level and state budgets. But if you are on this call or watching this webinar and you are someone who's working on fine and fee reforms at the local level, every city and county and town and village that I know of also releases a proposed budget book from their executive branch. And these budget books are often very similar to the state budget books. Sometimes they even contain a greater level of detail just because the jurisdictions are smaller, so they can dive in a little bit more. So if you are an advocate working on local reforms, you can certainly still use the takeaways and tools we talk about here for your own reform campaigns. All right, so let's get into it. What is in a budget book? The first thing we're going to talk about is the first half-ish of budget books often include a general overview of what's going on for that particular jurisdiction in terms of fiscal and economic health. And so there are many components of that you'll find in budget books that make up this general overview. We're going to be talking about 4 of them today, starting with letter from the governor. This is usually a 1 to 2 page document at the very front of the budget book. Usually it's like right after the table of contents. It's written in the governor's voice. And it's a very handy messaging tool that I like to turn to first and foremost, because usually it will highlight the major themes and values that the governor's office wants us to know that have been represented in the way that dollars have been assigned and the way that initiatives have been funded. And so it may lift up the most important projects that have been assigned the most amount of money, or certain values that the governor's office wants to show that they've upheld in the way that they've allocated out dollars in this proposed budget. You may find that the messaging in this letter from the governor closely mirrors messaging from State of the State speeches. If you're watching that or looking at a transcript of that, that is not a coincidence. State of the State usually happens right around the same time as the proposed budget and budget book is released. And in the State of the State, the governor is trying to show that they have fulfilled campaign promises and values that they said they would uphold in their tenure. And how did they do that? They pull evidence from what they've done in the budget. And so it's very common in State of the State speeches to see governors refer back over and over to what they've done in the budgets as a way to say, look what I have done. Look at the concrete manifestation of how I have upheld these values that I said I was going to uphold by prioritizing them in the budget. So as you're going through the letter from the governor, what I would recommend doing is looking for major themes and buzzwords and messaging that you might want to pull out and mirror in your campaign advocacy strategy and your messaging to try and show that your proposed reform, whether you're proposing doing a budget amendment and including it in the budget, or as standalone legislation that must ultimately be funded by revenue that is projected in the budget, should be included because it matches and aligns with the ideals that are already being upheld in the way that the dollars overall are being spent. And so we will go ahead and look at a couple of examples of letters from the governor so that you can just get a sense for how these things look in a very concrete way. So the first example we're going to look at is from Pennsylvania's fiscal 2024 budget and their letter from the governor. So this is just a snapshot here from what I think is like a 1.5 page document. So nice and short and sweet. And you can see it's written in the governor's voice to the people of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And when I scanned through this letter, there are a couple themes or buzzwords that stood out to me, one of which is around this idea that initiatives in the budget are being used as an opportunity to bring Republicans and Democrats together around common sense solutions. So what that says to me is bipartisanship is a value that's being upheld in the budget, and the governor wants everyone to know about it. And so you might, if you are in Pennsylvania and working on standalone legislation, you might want to highlight in your messaging with the governor's office or with legislators that you have both Republican and Democratic sponsors. And this bill and this reform really represents another example of bipartisanship and fits in with the rest of the values that are represented in the way that dollars are being assigned in the budget. Another set of buzzwords and theme that I'm seeing in the second paragraph here is talking about supporting law enforcement and making sure that our public safety system and our justice system is fair and functional and efficient. And those of us who work in the fine and fee reform space know very well that all too often trying to collect on fines and fees that people can't afford to pay in the first place makes these systems less efficient, less fair, less functional, because you have staff who are spending their time and efforts trying to collect on these dollars that are creating devastating impacts for community members and also taking them away from other important public safety and justice related activities. And so eliminating fines and fees might actually make these systems fairer. And that might be an argument that you want to lift up to the top of your campaign messaging plan if you are in a state that has a letter that mentions themes like this. We'll look at one other example here. This is Tennessee's fiscal 2024 budget letter from the governor. Again, looks very similar, also pretty short. I think this one's 2 pages, written in the governor's voice to the people of Tennessee. And here we see some slightly different themes. The ideas of fiscal responsibility is mentioned twice here in just half a page. And so perhaps in your fine or fee elimination reform campaign, you want to bring up the point that the revenue stream as it stands now is unreliable. It's been declining over the last few years. And so it's not fiscally responsible to leave it in the budget and assume that it will be able to continue funding operations. We also see some language here around wanting to fund initiatives that help Tennessee be a fast-growing economy, and wanting to make sure that funding is reserved to enable tax cuts for Tennessee families and small businesses. So this might be a space where if you're working in Tennessee, you might want to bring up the point front and center that eliminating fines and fees is one of the fastest and best ways that you can put money directly back in people's pockets, particularly people who are from communities who may be needing it the most. And so again, depending on what's in this letter, there may be types of messaging and types of arguments that you want to lift up or not lift up, depending on what you're seeing in this letter and who you are working with, the executive or the legislative branch, and the level of tension or non-tension there may be between those two branches. But it's a good reference point to sort of start and then think about how do you want to craft your messaging strategy relative to what you're seeing here in the budget. Okay, next we're going to be talking about process explainers, which are often also right at the front of budget books, and I find really helpful to check out no matter what point of the budget cycle or fiscal year we're in. If you are looking to get a lay of the land in your particular state and understand the different steps involved in the budget cycle, this is a really good place to look. We're going to look at an example again from Pennsylvania's fiscal 2024 budget. I think they have a really nice process explainer. They call it a reader's guide. And something I really appreciate that they have here is this really clear and simple chart that shows the different steps of the budget cycle in Pennsylvania throughout a fiscal year. And I think most importantly, also mentions who the major stakeholders and decision makers are at each step of the cycle. And so if I were someone that was just starting advocacy work in Pennsylvania, this would be really helpful for me to look at to know, okay, if I am doing my campaign planning and I know I want to be making major pushes in the fall and winter to try and get my reform into the budget, I know that I need to be talking to the governor's office because that's when they're reviewing and making decisions about what ends up in the budget. Something else that's small, but I really appreciate they include in this reader's guide is mentioning the specifics of Pennsylvania's fiscal year. Most states, but not all states, have fiscal years that run from July 1st to June 30th. And that means that one fiscal year will encompass 2 calendar years. And so I want to make sure we're really clear about the technical nomenclature of fiscal years before we move forward in the webinar. You're going to often see FY referring to fiscal year and then a year after it. So either 2024 or just 24. That number, that year, usually refers to the second calendar year that's encompassed in a fiscal year. So for example, fiscal 2024 budget is going to start on July 1st, 2023 and run through June 30th, 2024. Then on July 1st, 2024, that starts off fiscal year 25, and it runs all the way through June 30th, 2025. So that's just something to keep in mind for context as you are looking at these charts and as you are looking through different fiscal years. Okay, after process explainer, there's then often a good chunk of the budget book that's dedicated to an overall summary or financial plan that tells you overall about the economic and fiscal health of this particular year and this particular budget in the given state that you're looking at. And this is really helpful, I find, to just gain overall context of how is the budget doing? How is this state doing? And most importantly, how much wiggle room is there this year in terms of growth of the budget and available money for spending that can help me decide how to scale the magnitude of the reform that I'm proposing and the fiscal impact that it might have for the coming fiscal year. And this feels very important because if you're in a state that's experiencing really good fiscal times and the budget is growing quite a bit and there's a lot of wiggle room for lawmakers to play with and allocate additional new dollars for new initiatives, that's great. And that might mean you want to really step up the magnitude of the campaign that you're running and eliminate the entire finer fee stream, even though it may have a significant fiscal impact. If times are tighter and you're seeing the budget is shrinking or there's not much new money that lawmakers are saying that they can work with, then that might be a place where you want to consider, do I want to try and push this campaign over a multi-year timeline? Do I want to sort of scale the reform into more bite-sized pieces that we can get through to make sure that you're not proposing something that's so unreasonable relative to the fiscal picture that it gets stuck and dies in like an appropriations committee or a bill committee? So again, really good just overall context to help frame and contextualize your particular reform strategy. A couple examples we'll look at here. These will be examples of budget tables. I know that budget tables and financial tables can be really, can be intimidating sometimes because there's just so many numbers. And it's hard to pick out in the sea of numbers which ones are important for you and how to make them meaningful. And so a theme that I'll say now, and you'll hear me say in future slides, is I always recommend going into these kind of tables knowing what is the question you are asking. So for example, I'm about to show you a screenshot of New York's fiscal 2024 budget, and I'm going to be looking to understand the question of how is the budget changing from previous years? Is there more money to work with or is there less money to work with? Again, because that might help me scale and contextualize my planned reform campaign to eliminate a particular finer fee. So this is New York's financial plan table. And the first thing I always do when I'm looking at a financial table is I glance at the title to make sure I understand what the numbers are representing. So this is looking at key measures of disbursements of funds, so the overall budget. And one thing I noticed right away is they are telling me that the numbers here are represented in millions of dollars. This is a tiny thing, but an important thing to read, because otherwise you might think that first number there, that 123, might be representing $123,751, but it's the state of New York. So we are in fact talking about $123 billion, $751 million, which is of course a very big difference. So it's just really important to make sure you're getting the proper context of the magnitude of the numbers here. And then there are two columns here where they're showing you how things are changing for size of the budget year over year. First, we have fiscal 2023 actuals. Actuals is a technical budget terminology, financial terminology that means the money that actually came in the door. So at the end of the fiscal year, all the dollars that were collected are spent or totaled, and those are called actuals. The next column shows you fiscal 2024 projected. Projections are what the budget is planning on and assuming will come in the door, but hasn't actually seen come in the door yet. So these are determined at the beginning of the fiscal year when the budget is proposed and then enacted, and depends on, of course, all sorts of like modeling and forecasting usually, and involves making assumptions around what you think is going to come in and go out the door from state coffers. And so you can see the change year over year that can help us contextualize what is happening in terms of the growth of the budget. They show here in this table a bunch of different ways to look at that growth. I'm going to point out two that I think are the most useful for gaining overall context from an advocate perspective. The first is looking at state operating funds and what is going on year over year here. And so this is all the different types of funds that the state uses to operate. And you can see here that first they give you the straight numbers. I don't look at those as much when I'm looking at these kind of tables because they're not as meaningful to me because they're just so big. I don't know how to contextualize that magnitude. What I do know how to contextualize is percent growth. And so I find really useful this annual growth number that's right beneath it that tells me in fiscal 23, New York's operating budget grew about 5%. larger than in fiscal 22. And then in fiscal 24, I see that number change, and it's a smaller number. So it's only growing about 1.3% from fiscal 2023. And what that might say to me is it might just put up a slightly like yellow flag for me of if I'm in fiscal 2024 and I'm trying to propose a finer fee reform that may cost a significant amount of money and have a big fiscal impact, legislators might be less willing to have those discussions in fiscal 24 than they did in fiscal 23. So maybe I just need to be cautious and strategic about how I'm going to make the fiscal argument that this reform is important enough and makes sense and is fiscally responsible enough that it should be prioritized in the general fund that is available for spending. And then the other key measure here that I think is probably the most useful that I would always recommend folks look at when they're looking into budget trends is seeing what's going on with the general fund. For those who aren't familiar with the term, the general fund is a big discretionary pot of money at the state or local level that makes up the majority of how a government's operations and agencies get funded. And most of your major tax bases go into the general fund. So think like your income tax, your property tax, your business tax, sometimes licenses and fees, sometimes fines and fees from courts, sometimes not. It really depends on statute and what statute determines about where each particular fine or fee goes. But once a dollar goes into the general fund, it loses its label as whatever specific type of revenue source it was before, and it just becomes part of the general fund. And lawmakers have a lot of discretion to allocate general fund dollars wherever they want to put them in terms of agencies, operations, initiatives being funded, as opposed to non-general fund dollars like federal funding, which often has a lot more restrictions around what kind of spending you can use that money for. So general fund is a really good measure of sort of like how much discretionary wiggle room do lawmakers have to do new things. And you can see, looking at the annual growth numbers here, that this general fund growth shows a different story than what we just saw. So in fiscal 23, it's pretty similar. There's a little over 4% growth from the previous year. But then look at fiscal 24. The general fund's growing 12.5% over fiscal 2023. Very different from that 1.3% overall operating growth. And the difference in those two numbers, probably, just my best guess, is the fact that federal dollars that came in hordes in fiscal 21 and 22 and 23 because of emergency pandemic aid, those dollars are by and large going away now. And so that's sort of when you're looking at the overall funding sources as a whole in the operating budget, that sort of like shrinks down the picture of how the budget's growing. But the general fund in itself and all those tax bases that make up the general fund, that's doing really well. It's like tripling its growth from the previous year. And so maybe you do then want to propose a more aggressive reform, and you might want to use this 12.5% as an important talking point to explain to legislators just why, yes, it is possible for us to do this year, even though there is a fiscal impact. We must prioritize it within our general fund and look at how much general fund we have to play with. Now I'm going to show you a similar table in Nevada's fiscal 2023 to 2025 budget. They do their budget in 2-year increments, but it's set up a little bit differently. So I'll show you a couple other common elements of these tables. So here we have Nevada's financial plan summary. Again, looking at the title right away, you can see they're looking at appropriations and authorizations. Both of those are just financial terminology for legally assigning dollars to be spent down by certain agencies for certain types of operations. And then also at the top of the table, you see that this is looking at the 23 through 25 biennium, so spanning 2 years. So again, helps me just sort of set my context and ground me in what these numbers are showing me. Unlike the New York table on the previous slide, which just showed us the overall budget change, Nevada here has broken down budget changes over time into different program areas. So this could be useful if, for example, you wanted to hone in on like what's going on with public safety spending. Is that growing or shrinking over years? How are we changing the way that we are prioritizing public safety spending over these 2 years? That could be useful to you. And then similar to New York, they have looked at both what's going on in the general fund and then what's going on in everything else that's not the general fund. And then putting those together, what's going on with the budget in total. And so if we just take a quick look at fiscal 2024, we can see a similar picture where the general fund is growing a lot by over 13%, but then in non-general fund world, again, probably mostly these federal dollars and the one-time emergency aid going away, we see the budget actually shrinking and kind of losing those one-time dollars. That's not necessarily like bad or unexpected, because everyone in the budget world knew that those dollars were always meant to be one time and should have been spent down for like one-time purposes. But it does mean that the budget doesn't look as large as it did the previous year when there were more of these federal dollars. And so overall, the budget looks like it's shrinking. But again, if you look at the general fund section by itself, there's a lot of growth there, which might mean being able to make a very strong argument for implementing the elimination of a certain finer fee, and replacing that harmful finer fee with general fund instead. All right, so again, every budget book is different. Everyone's financial plan summary will look different, but it's a really good place for you to examine these tables, go in knowing what you're looking for, understand questions like what is the economic and fiscal health in the coming year? What are reserves and fund balance looking like? Because those are two places where governments can sort of have robust reserves ready to go in the case of financial downturns, which can minimize financial risk looking ahead into the next year. All of these things, really helpful context to gain if you are working on any sort of campaign that may have a fiscal impact for the coming year. The last thing we're going to look at in this general overview section is priority initiative summary. And so this is where, not always, but sometimes, budget books will have a list of the most exciting, the biggest ticket items that are being funded, again, incrementally, so new from last year, with new revenue that has been coming in. And I'm going to show you an example here from Georgia's fiscal 2023 and 24 budget. And I find this, I find this really useful to be able to just sort of see the quick hits of like what kind of really concrete things, not just values that were talked about in the governor's letter, but like what kind of concrete spending items were prioritized the most. You can see in Georgia here that they've done it by department. And again, this is an area where it's good to go in knowing what you're looking for. So if I go in thinking, do I see anything here that is similar to the campaign reform that I am working on, or really different that I want to like lift up and juxtapose and say like, we can fund this, but we can't fund this. Let's get our priorities in order. And as I'm scanning this page, thinking from a fine and fee reform context, something that might stand out to me is in the Department of Corrections. I might want to say something like, oh, look, we were able to find the money to fund $26 million to maintain and repair our jails. Isn't it equally important that we are also finding the money to make sure that we are valuing the dignity and the lives of the people who are staying in those jails, who are incarcerated, and making sure that they don't leave those jails with a mountain of debt? Oh, well, then we need to implement this reform that would eliminate this particular cost of incarceration or something like that. So again, you can lift up something to sort of compare and say, look, same thing. This goes along with it. Let's include it in the budget, or kind of juxtapose against, again, whatever works for you. So now we've hit upon different sections, usually towards the first half of budget books, that talk about an overall overview, what's going on with the budget as a whole. Now we're going to move into what's going on by agency. So again, usually, but not always, state budgets will include a section in the budget book that breaks down key initiatives and narrative and messaging by agency or by program area. And this can be really helpful if you are going in, again, knowing what you're looking for, to try and learn more about an agency that may be collecting and then spending down the dollars that are collected from a finer fee stream that you are trying to reform or eliminate in your advocacy campaign. So the first thing that you'll often see in these agency sections is a summary of each agency's operation and funding structures. And this, kind of similar to the financial plan summaries, are really good to give you context. As an example, we'll look at Minnesota's fiscal 2025 budget in their Department of Corrections. that have like a really clear layout of their summary. So you can see at the very top here, a very high overview of the Department of Corrections, how many people work in it, how big of magnitude the operations of the department are as a whole. And then you see in the middle of the page a little bit of narrative around their purpose. This is, again, where you could pull out pieces of messaging that talk about the department's priorities and values, and you can try and mirror those with messaging in your campaign to show the department's already said they value doing this, so therefore let's put that in action by implementing this campaign reform. And then at the bottom of the page, they have a couple charts that show how dollars are coming in and going out. So on the left, you can see a pie chart showing the major ways in which dollars are spent in the department. And then on the right, you see a chart of historical spending, which shows you where their funding is coming from. And it can be a little hard to tell because I know they're all shades of blue, but this like periwinkle blue represents the general fund. And you can see that the general fund makes up almost the entirety of funding in every single year for the Department of Corrections. And that can be valuable because if you're arguing to eliminate a particular fine or fee that right now is going into the Department of Corrections and being used on spending to fund some sort of jail operations or prison operations, then you may be able to make a strong argument that says, the state has already decided that this department should be essentially funded by general fund because general fund makes up almost the entirety of its funding. It would be a drop in the bucket to add a little bit more general fund over on top of that to fill the hole that would be left by this finer fee revenue, but it's not significant relative to the amount of general fund they're already getting. And so charts like these can help you come up with and build your fiscal talking points to help legislators understand why it may not be a fiscally big deal to replace a finer fee stream in that department with general fund at the end of the day. One other thing I want to show you about, we're still in Minnesota's Department of Corrections agency summary. I want to show you this page because I think it's a good example of how the dollars that come into each agency often get categorized by funds, and the funds often are labeled by the type of revenue they contain. And so this is another way of looking at the same picture. It shows you out of the total bucket of money that the Department of Corrections has, most of that money is coming from this Fund 1000, which is the general fund funds. So all the dollars that are made up of general fund. And then only a little bit of money is coming in from these other sources or these other funds. And a point to make here, I know I'm showing you expenditures or spending, but remember that budgets have to be balanced at the state or local level. So expenditures have to equal revenue. And usually funds have to be balanced at the major fund level too. So I'm making the assumption that when I'm looking at this amount of money in expenditures, it mirrors the amount of money that's coming in as revenue to fund those expenditures. One other fund, two other funds I just want to point out here are these special revenue funds. And that's because often at the state level, it can be hard to see, like there's not usually a fund called like the fine and fee fund. If there is, that's great, you found it. But often they get incorporated into these larger funds, which are often called like miscellaneous funds, special revenue funds. But it can be useful to find them because once you find the fund that is most likely to hold the finer fee stream that you're interested in looking at, you can then go back to statute and try and find references to that fund. Or you can do a public records request and try and dig deeper in that fund to then get your hands on data showing exactly how much of the revenue stream in this fund is coming from the finer fee you want to look at and uncover data about. So two different examples here of summary overviews of an agency. What you'll also see in agency sections is often overviews of the new major budget changes that are being funded and recommended in this proposed budget. And this can be really useful if you have a reform that is being included in the budget and you want to check and make sure it is what you thought it was and it's being funded the way you thought it was going to be funded. Or you can also, again, go into it looking for other budget changes that may be similar to yours or ones that you might want to lift out and say like, why are we funding this? Instead, let's fund this as part of your campaign strategy. So we're going to stick with Minnesota's fiscal 2025 budget, still looking at Department of Corrections here. This is an example of what they call a budget change item, which is a package of type of spending that they are newly getting relative to the previous year. So you can see what it's for. It's for increased funding for community supervision here. You can see what kind of dollars are being used to fund it. So you can see it's general fund dollars from this table right here. And then you can see some narrative around why the department thinks that this is an important initiative to implement and fund and what they think it's going to do. And again, could be useful messaging to pull out, check, make sure it's what you thought it was, lift up, juxtapose, whatever you want to do, depending on your campaign strategy. Now we're going to get into what is really at the heart of what I am often looking for when I'm doing fiscal analysis and diving into budget books to find useful data, which is revenue and expenditure detail at the agency level. This is sometimes included in state budgets, sometimes not. More often, I find it in local budgets, again, because they're smaller and can go into more detail more easily often. But if you can find these in your budget books, you can sometimes find really detailed and helpful tables that tell you exactly how much money is coming in from particular finer fee revenue streams and where that money is being spent, what kind of spending items it's attached to. And so this is the one case where I'm going to deviate from our state snapshot look. And I'm going to show you a very local budget book. This is from the budget of Freeport, New York, and it's their fiscal 2024 general fund budget table. So showing all the different types of revenue streams that come into the general fund. And the reason I'm showing you this one is I happened upon it recently through another project, and it was a really, really good example, I thought, of being able to look at a big table with lots of data about specific revenue streams and be able to pull out at least 3 different types of stories about that data that can be helpful to you in finer fee reform campaigns. So I'm going to go through those with you right now. So this is, again, we're looking at a general fund table for the village of Freeport, New York. And the revenue stream I want to focus on here is this fines and forfeitures revenue stream. And just for the sake of hypotheticals and this exercise now, I'm going to pretend that this is referring only to court-related fines and forfeitures. And then you have a bunch of columns that give you a bunch of data about what's going on with this revenue stream. And we're going to go through 3 different ways to look at that data. The first way is to look at what's actually coming in the door. And so they show us for fiscal 21 and then also for fiscal 22, there were about $2.1 million collected in fiscal 21, and that decreased a lot to about $1.3 million collected in fiscal 22. And that tells me one aspect of the story. That tells me that year over year, at least for those 2 years, revenue was declining. And that might be evidence for me to be able to show that it is an unstable or volatile revenue stream. So an important part of the story to know. Then if we move over to the right, to these columns I've highlighted in yellow, we see what's going on with what the budget expected or projected, which is shown in that adopted budget column, compared to what actually came in the door. So were expectations on point, or were collections way under expectations or way over expectations? And we can see here that what the budget projected at the beginning of the fiscal year was that about $1.2 million were coming in. So it looked like they kind of aligned themselves with how revenue collections were looking in fiscal 22. And then we can see this actual to date means what's actually coming in the door. And we can see a pretty similar picture. It looks like actual collections are lined up pretty well with expectations. And so that tells me another piece of the story. It's not necessarily good or bad, but it does tell me for that particular year that the way that money was projected or planned on in the budget matches pretty well to what ended up happening. And then the third piece of the story that we can look at is what's being assumed for future years. And so if you look at the budget request column for 2024, that shows what the department who collects and holds this money before then sending it to the treasurer and having it centralized in the general fund, what they thought would come in the door for fiscal 2024, what they requested to be included in that budget. This last column, the adopted budget column, shows you at the end of the day, not sure if it was the executive branch or the legislative branch, but they changed things a little bit. And by the time the budget was passed into law, they actually upped that projected revenue to about $1.3 million. And so that could mean a couple different things. It could mean that there was a different revenue forecasting methodology that was used that changed the numbers a little bit. It could also mean that there was some lawmaker who gave some direction that enforcement efforts needed to be upped in order to gain more revenue to make sure that there was enough money for funding planned expenditures. I don't know what that story is, but it is important, I think, to notice that trend so that if you then are working on reform for that finer fee or trying to understand what's going on with that revenue stream, you can dig deeper into that and try and uncover more of that story. So again, lots of data here, lots of numbers, but each one of these columns and each one of these numbers tells us a different piece of the story that can be helpful when you're trying to build a narrative about what's going on with this revenue stream and why it should be eliminated or changed. The last thing I'm going to talk to you all today about in budget books is performance measures. And these are usually included in agency level sections of the budget book. And they are different metrics of success that show how good a job each agency is doing at implementing the initiatives that were funded in their budget. And so this could look anything from the Department of Transportation having a performance measure around the number of red light camera tickets that were issued. And that might be important if you're trying to make an argument around making sure that automated traffic enforcement revenue doesn't become a revenue generator in the city or state that you're working on. Another example that we'll look at right now is going to New Mexico's fiscal 2023 budget. We're going to be looking at their judiciary's performance measures. So if you look down all the way down at the end of the page to their Administrative Office of the Courts Division, they have some performance measures specifically on cost per juror and number of jury trials. And last year, our New Mexico state team at FFJC, along with other advocate partners, worked to get jury fees along with other different court fees eliminated and no longer used as a revenue stream in the budget. And so if they hadn't already done that work, and if I was hypothetically doing that work right now, I might find it really interesting to be able to understand how much it costs per juror and how many jury trials the state sees every year to help me do some back of the envelope math to come up with how much is it costing the state to have juries right now, and then compare that overall number with how much is being collected and assessed from people who are interacting with the criminal legal system. And does that proportion make sense? Is that outsized? Is that totally inequitable and sort of like highlights injustice? Does it actually seem to make sense? Again, you can kind of use those numbers to tell the story that you want to tell and make the arguments that you want to make. But this can be a really useful place, performance measures, to find data that can help you do that math and make those arguments. So we've talked about a lot in the last hour, and we've talked about a lot of different elements of budget books that, again, are going to be a little bit different from state to state, from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but using them all together, you as an advocate can use the budget book to do things like understand and leverage the greater revenue picture and fiscal context by looking at financial plan tables or agency-specific fund tables and revenue detail. You can identify key messaging and storytelling for your advocacy and use that to maximize the effectiveness of your campaign by looking at documents like letter from the governor, by looking at highlighted funded initiatives, by looking at narratives from department level summaries in the back half of the budget book. And hopefully, if your budget book is good, you can find data on revenue collection and changes over time that can help you really understand the story of what's going on with the particular finer fee stream that you're interested at looking at and potentially changing. So with that, I hope that you now feel more equipped and empowered to exercise your civic power, to crack open the budget book, and to use it to make your advocacy as effective as it can possibly be. And I will stop it here and go ahead and look at the Q&A to see if we can answer some questions that folks may have. Okay, a question here from Brendan says, do governors and mayors and legislators usually adjust the budget with specific initiatives in mind? For example, like $1 million for rental assistance, or do they focus more on total dollar amounts, like 10 million for housing? I think both and. Some of that depends about like local versus state level. State, you're at such a high magnitude of funds and like operations that things I feel like tend to get packaged more as like big round numbers for big categories of funding initiatives that then get broken down into like grant programs or specific ways to allocate out to locals that then might have their own, you know, special circumstances. But it kind of just, it really depends on the legislator, and it kind of depends on the particular structure of that budget process. Budget, someone else asked, where can I find budget information from municipalities? Same way that you would look for a budget book at the state level, just Google like city of whatever budget book, and some sort of budget office is likely going to pop up that hopefully also has this same sort of structure of budget book. And in that same place where you find budget books, you'll often find other types of public budget documents, maybe about the enacted budget or about like mid-year recap or end of year financial recaps that will usually kind of be in the same place. You can look at those other tools as well. Someone else asked, by the time of the enacted budget, is it too late to get the local or state to make changes or advocate till the next year? This is a great question. Usually once the budget is passed into law, it becomes law, right? And so in order to change the way that dollars are authorized, if you want to spend them differently, so you want to reallocate funds or you want to spend new money, you have to change the law. And so that often requires what's called a mid-year budget supplemental, which means you literally put forward a mid-year piece of legislation that says we want to change the way that we've legally assigned out these dollars, or we want to legally recognize this new revenue source and use it to do this thing. That can be tricky to do mid-year. Legislators often don't love doing that mid-year. I used to hate doing that mid-year as someone who worked in a budget office. Because the whole idea behind the annual budget process is you look at everything at one point in time in one big snapshot. It is possible though. So certainly it's a possible avenue if you're trying to push a mid-year change. And then I would also just add, it's never too early to start talking to agencies or governor's office or whoever you have relationships with to try and incorporate your reform in for the next budget cycle as early as possible. Because if you can be having months of conversations by the time the governor even starts to review budget proposals, then you've probably got a good leg in the door to make sure that yours is one of the many hundreds of changes that are going to be funded with that big change in general fund. Let's see, another question here says, do you have any examples of state budgets being shared as open data in a machine readable format, not a PDF? Yes. Virginia is one I looked at recently where their budget breaks down into this really nice visual format really easily, where you like click on the department and then something new opens, and then you click on the fund and something new opens. Another one, Minnesota also has some of this, like their budget book seems to be broken down into like a bunch of little mini books, agency by agency, which I found a little bit easier to navigate. And then others is just like one giant PDF. So it kind of just depends on the budget book, and you just have to Google and see what you can find for your state. Great question here about why are dollar amounts in parentheses. This was a little bit weird to me in Freeport. I would not usually have put revenue dollars in parentheses, and I'm not positive why they did, but usually revenue shows up as positive numbers and expenditures show up in parentheses as like negative numbers to show those dollars are leaving the budget. You will often see that in financial tables, so that if you're looking at revenues together with expenditures, the total you'll get is zero. And that's how you know you've got a balanced budget. You got your positive numbers for all the money coming in, your negative numbers for all the money coming out. And then if you balance correctly, you have a zero at the end to show this budget is balanced. I think those are all the questions that I'm seeing now. Again, we have been recording this webinar. We will share it out to all the attendees after we finish up here, and we'll make it available to folks to see at any point in time on our FFJC clearinghouse. So feel free to access it at any time. And I hope that it can be a useful tool to all of the incredible and important work that you all are doing in states around the country to make our public budget systems and our criminal legal systems more fair and just through fines and fees reform. I just got asked by our comms team if I'm down for a few more questions. I am. So again, if you have to hop off now, we are still recording, but I am happy to take a couple more questions. Okay, this question says, for a city budget, when you see the fines and penalties budget lines, how do you find the disaggregated numbers on the major sources and accounts? This is a great question, one that I do not have a great answer to, and one that's frustrating for me and many people. At the state and the local levels, oftentimes fines and fees will be aggregated into this revenue line. That's sometimes they break it up into like licenses and fees and then fines and forfeitures. And that can be really unhelpful because licenses and fees can cover everything from like new business fees, as well as like court fees, right? And so it can be hard to break apart. And this is where you sometimes may want to first notice the trends that you're still seeing in the budget book. Notice overall if things are going up and down, because that can give you helpful like big picture hints about what may be going on. But this may be where you may need to do open records requests or look into other more detailed financial documents that are often produced by the Office of the Comptroller, like end of year financial reports, informally called the CAFR. They sometimes, not always, but sometimes will have revenue broken down into greater detail. It again just kind of depends on how the financial documents and structures for a particular jurisdiction are set up. Are city managers the best point of contact to present findings for reforms or new process? This is a great question. I think in part depends jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And it depends at what point of the budget cycle you are in and wanting to interact in. So if you are working in a city where the city manager is in charge of putting out the proposed budget, not the mayor, which happens in some cities, and you're at the point during the year where the city manager is reviewing all proposals, like, yes, go to the city manager and talk to them. But if the person who's reviewing all those proposals is actually the mayor, then you may actually want to go to the mayor's office. If you're at the point of the year where the city manager has already proposed their budget and now you have a board of supervisors or a city council looking at it, you may want to go to them. So again, pick your stakeholders based on the point of the budget cycle that you're in to make sure that you're talking to the people that can make decisions at that point in the budget process. Okay, locally, we have a budget line after an adopted budget line called revised budget. Is that the same thing as mid-year budget supplemental or a similar amendment process? Great question. In some states or local jurisdictions, this is especially the case for revenue. After the budget is enacted, so that would be that like adopted budget line, as they go through the year, it's not that they're changing law, so it wouldn't be a mid-year budget supplemental is my best guess, but sometimes different revenue forecast teams will go in at different points during the year. Hopefully your jurisdiction does this. It's a very fiscally responsible thing to do. And they'll reproject. They'll say, okay, knowing what we didn't know 3 months ago about what's happening with the economy and inflation and cost of living and all of those things, we have a revised picture of what revenue might look like that we're coming in. We've adjusted our formulas a little bit to match the most up-to-date economic picture we have. And that can be a really helpful benchmark to look at so you can kind of see how budget dependency on a particular fine or fee source is changing not only from year to year, but throughout the year. Thanks for bringing that up. Okay, I think that was the last question for now. As you can probably tell from this webinar, I love talking budgets. I love helping people access budgets. So I hope this was helpful for you, and I'm always happy to work with state or local partners to explore their budgets more in depth. Thank you for listening to this webinar. We will be doing future budget episodes of this webinar series, so TBD on that. And I hope you all have a wonderful day.